I still remember the first night when I truly realized something I'd never dared to think about. That night, rain was falling gently in the yard, dripping on the mango leaves swaying in the breeze. I was sitting alone in the living room waiting for my wife to come home from work when I heard soft footsteps coming from the kitchen. When I turned around, my mother-in-law was standing there, holding 2 cups of warm tea with a smile that felt so comforting. Her soft face looked younger under the yellow light of the living room. She sat beside me close enough that I could smell the scent of soap on her still slightly damp hair. At first, we just talked about ordinary things, about work, about the weather, about everyday life, everyday life. But somehow, every word she said that night felt different. There was a warmth that was hard to explain. There was a concern that was too genuine to be taken for granted. That's when I started to realize I never intended to get close to my own mother-in-law. But somehow, her attention slowly made my heart waver. My name is Arga. I'm 33 years old. I work as a project staff at a contractor company in the city. My life is actually nothing special, but I always feel enough. I had a steady job, a good wife, and a warm home to come home to every night. After marrying Maya, we decided to move in with her mother. Maya's father had passed away a few years ago due to illness, and Mrs. Laris had lived alone ever since. Maya felt bad about leaving her mother alone in a large, quiet house. At first I was hesitant. After all, living with in-laws isn't easy for many people. But my worries turned out to be unfounded. Mrs. Laras was a very gentle and caring woman. She never acted like a parent who likes to interfere in her child's household affairs. Instead, she always tried to make me feel comfortable as part of the family. Every morning, the aroma of Mrs. Laris's cooking always filled the kitchen. She almost never let us go to work without breakfast. Sometimes she made fried rice, sometimes just toast and eggs. But there was always something that made the morning feel warmer. Arga, don't forget to eat breakfast, she usually called from the kitchen. Her tone was always gentle, like a truly sincere mother. My relationship with Mrs. Lara was actually very ordinary at first. We rarely spoke at length. At most, we exchanged a few light sentences about work or the state of the house, but over time, little habits began to form. Because Maya often came home late from her job at the drugstore, I was often the first to arrive home. In almost every afternoon, Mrs. Laris was always in the living room or kitchen. Sometimes she was watering the plants, sometimes cutting fruit. When I arrived, she always greeted me with a warm smile. "Tired from work, huh?" she asked one afternoon. I just chuckled. "Not bad, Mom." Then she usually went into the kitchen and came out with a glass of hot tea or coffee. At first, I thought it was just a simple gesture of friendliness, but over time, I began to notice something different. Mrs. Laris always seemed to be waiting for me to come home. One afternoon, when I arrived earlier than usual because work was finished early, I saw Mrs. Laris sitting alone on the front porch. She looked a little surprised to see me. "Oh, Arga's home," she said with a smile. I nodded. "Yes, Mom, he's home early today." She immediately stood up. "Hold on a minute, Mom. Let me make some tea." Little things like that repeated almost every day. Without me realizing it, those simple moments became a habit that began to feel enjoyable. We often sat in the living room while waiting for Maya to come home. Sometimes we watched television together. Sometimes we just chatted lightly about everyday life. It was through these stories that I began to get to know Mrs. Laris better. She told me stories of her youth, about how she met her husband at a night market, about their struggles to build a family from scratch, poverty. Sometimes she laughed when she remembered the past. Sometimes her voice grew soft when she mentioned her deceased husband's name. "Since Maya's father died, this house feels different," she said one night in a low voice. I could only listen silently. There was a palpable loneliness in her tone. And perhaps that's why I subconsciously began to feel the urge to accompany her more often. At first, I never thought anything of it. For me, it was just a show of concern for my mother-in-law who lived alone. But over time, something began to change in the way I viewed her. One night, while we were watching television in the living room, I finally noticed it. The living room lamp was emitting a soft yellow glow.
Mrs. Laris was sitting beside me laughing at a comedy show on television. As she turned to me, her slightly wavy hair fell gently over her shoulders. For the first time, I truly looked at her face. Her skin was still smooth, her eyes soft, and her somehow felt so warm. That's when a strange thought suddenly popped into my head. A thought that made me immediately feel guilty. I immediately turned my gaze to the television. However, since that night, I began to realize something I had never considered before. I had never intended to get close to my own mother-in-law. But somehow, her attention slowly began to make my heart waver.
Honestly, I never thought such feelings could arise within me. Every time the thought came, I always tried to push it away as far as possible. I reminded myself that Mrs. Laris was my wife's mother, a woman I had respected since I first met her. But strangely, the more I tried to reject those feelings, the more I noticed the little things about her. The way she smiled when I came home from work. The way she always asked if I had eaten. I'd eaten? The way she sat in the living room waiting for me, watching television with the volume turned down. The simple things that had once seemed ordinary now began to feel different. A few days after the night, I realized that feeling, a small incident, made everything much more complicated. That day, Maya came home very late because she had a stockpile of medicine to count at work. I had been home since the afternoon, and it had been raining nonstop since dusk. The house felt very quiet. I was sitting in the living room when Mrs. Laris came out of the kitchen with 2 cups of hot tea. "Drink this, Arga. The rain is very cold tonight," she said softly. I nodded and accepted the cups. We sat side by side on the long sofa facing the television, which was showing the evening news. However, neither of us was really paying attention to what was being shown. The sound of the rain outside seemed much clearer. Several minutes passed in silence. Then suddenly Mrs. Laris said softly, as if talking to herself, "This house feels very quiet when Maya isn't home." I turned to her. She was staring out the window, watching the raindrops flow down the glass. For the first time, I saw such a palpable loneliness on her face. "Does Mom often feel like that?" I asked cautiously. Mrs. Laris smiled a little, but it didn't really hide her sadness. "Since Maya's father died, this house feels too big to live in alone," she said, quietly. Her words made my chest feel heavy. I could imagine how it must have felt to lose someone who had accompanied me for decades. Unconsciously, I said, "Now you're not alone anymore." Mrs. Laris turned to me. Her gaze felt different that night. Warmer, but also deeper. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Now you're here." It was quiet again. I tried to distract myself by watching television, but my mind was no longer focused. A few minutes later, the power suddenly went out. The room plunged into darkness. "Oh my," Mrs. Lara said, slightly surprised. I stood up to look for a candle in the living room cupboard. When I returned with a small lit candle, the dim light illuminated both of our faces. We sat back on the sofa. The candlelight cast shadows slowly across the wall. I don't know why the atmosphere that night felt so different. It was as if the whole house was holding its breath. Bueller suddenly rubbed his hands together in the cold. "Yeah, the rain is getting colder," he said. Without thinking, I said, "Here, Mom." I moved the thin blanket from the back of the sofa to his shoulders. But as I did, my
hand accidentally touched hers. It was only a brief touch, but it felt like something had grabbed me in the chest. Bularis didn't immediately pull his hand away. Instead, he stared at me. In the dim candlelight, his face seemed very close. I could feel my heart beating much faster than usual. Several seconds passed without a word. Then Mrs. Laris took a deep breath and said in a voice that was almost a whisper, "Arga, you're a very kind person." I didn't know how to answer. I just stared at her nervously. And that's when I began to feel something far more dangerous than mere guilt. Because from the way Bularis looked at me that night, I began to realize something that made me increasingly uneasy. Ingmar. It seemed like I wasn't the only one who was starting to feel something that shouldn't be there between us. That realization made my chest feel even heavier. The night of the power outage finally passed without a hitch. There were no strange words, nothing that really crossed the line. But that's precisely why it all felt so much more disturbing. Because I knew something had changed. The next day, I tried to act as usual. I woke up early and had breakfast with Maya and Mrs. Lara, as we always did. I tried to chat casually, as if nothing had happened the night before. However, every time I met Mrs. Lara's eyes, I felt my heart beat faster. She also seemed a little different. Usually, she was very relaxed when talking to me, but that morning she seemed quieter, as if she was hiding something we both understood. I went to work feeling uneasy. All day, my thoughts kept returning to the previous night. I tried to focus on my work, but the image of Mrs. Loris's face in the candlelight kept popping into my head. By the time I got home that evening, I had already made a decision in my heart. I had to distance myself. I couldn't let these feelings grow any further. My marriage with Maya was too precious to risk it just because of something I hadn't even planned on. In the following days, I started to change my habits. I came home from work later than usual. I often pretended to be busy with my laptop in my room. I avoided sitting alone with Mrs. Laris in the living room like we used to. At first, I thought it would work. But the opposite happened. Bularis began to notice a change in my attitude. One afternoon, as I had just entered the house, she called out to me from the kitchen. "Arga, just a moment." Her tone was gentle, but there was something about her that made me unable to refuse. I entered the kitchen and saw her cutting fruit at the table. "Yes, Mom?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. She just put the knife on the table and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You've been coming home late lately," she said quietly. "You've got a lot of work to do, Mom," I answered quickly. Mrs. Lara smiled faintly. "But I used to be busy too, Arga. It's just that you still had time to sit in the living room for a while." I fell silent. I didn't know what to say. She then said, in even softer voice, "If I did something that made you uncomfortable, I apologize." The words felt like they were pressing something inside my chest. I immediately shook my head. "It's not like that, Mom. I didn't do anything wrong." "Then why did you stay away?" The question left me completely at a loss for words. I wanted to be honest, but I couldn't possibly tell the truth. How could I say that I stayed away because I was afraid of feelings that shouldn't even exist? I finally just spoke softly. I just didn't want to make things awkward. Bularis stared at me for a long moment. There was something very deep in her eyes that night. Then she took a deep breath and said, "Arga, I'm not stupid." Those words made my heart beat faster. She continued in a voice barely a whisper. Mother felt the same way. The world seemed to stop for a moment around me. I never imagined she would say that directly. The kitchen suddenly felt very cramped. I didn't dare look at her again. A few seconds later, I said in a trembling voice, "We can't let this happen." Mrs. Laris didn't answer. She just lowered her head and went back to cutting fruit on the table, as if trying to hide her feelings. But before I left the kitchen, she said quietly, "Arga, feelings sometimes come without us asking."
I stopped walking, and her last words that night made my thoughts even more chaotic and chaotic. The hard part wasn't stopping the feelings, but pretending they never happened.
Dolores' words from that night kept ringing in my head, even after I entered the room. The words were simple, but they felt like something hitting me in the chest over and over again. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the floor without really thinking. In the living room, the television was still playing softly. Maya hadn't come home from work yet, and in the kitchen, Mrs. Laris was probably still standing there with the same complicated feelings. That night, I could barely sleep. My mind was filled with a reality that I could no longer avoid. That feeling was not only inside me, but also inside Mrs. Laris's heart. The following days felt much harder. We both tried to act normal in front of Maya. We still ate together, still talked as usual. But behind it all was a tension that no one could see. Every time our eyes met, we immediately looked away. Whenever it was just the two of us in the same room, the atmosphere felt awkward and full of pressure. I began to feel like the house that had once felt warm had now become a place full of anxiety. However, things really reached their most difficult point when news came from Maya. One night while we were having dinner together, Maya said casually, quote, "I have a training session from the office next week." I turned around. "What training?" "A 3-day training session in Surabaya. All new employees had to attend." My heart immediately felt uneasy. 3 days, I asked. Maya nodded. "Yeah, leaving Monday morning." I reflexively looked at Mrs. Lara. She looked at me too. We both immediately understood the same thing. For those 3 days, it would be just Mrs. Laris and I in this house. The first day, when Maya left, felt strange. The house was very quiet. There was no sound of Maya joking around in the living room. There was no sound of her busy footsteps in the kitchen. It was just Mrs. Laris and me. We tried to avoid situations that would leave us alone for too long. I ate early and went to my room. Mrs. Laris was mostly in the yard tending to the plants. But the more we tried to distance ourselves, the more obvious the feelings we were trying to hide became. On the second night, the rain came down again heavily, just like the night the power went out. I was sitting in the living room when Mrs. Laris came out of the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee. She placed 1 cup on the table in front of me. "Have a drink," she said quietly. I nodded. We sat on the same sofa, but farther apart than usual. It was very quiet. Only the sound of the rain could be heard from outside. Several minutes passed without conversation. Then Mrs. Laris suddenly said, "Arga, we can't go on like this." I turned to her. "I know," I answered quietly. She looked at the floor. Every day, pretending nothing happened, it felt heavier. I took a deep breath. I knew she was right. This situation couldn't go on if we kept suppressing these feelings without doing anything. One day, everything could explode and destroy more things and destroy more things. I looked at her seriously. "Mom, we have to stop this." Mrs. Laris slowly lifted her head. "I've tried, Arga." The sound of the rain grew louder. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other. Then, in a barely audible voice, Mrs. Laris said, "Have we never felt the desire to stay close?" That question was like a final test for my heart. Because actually I knew the answer. I did feel it. But that's precisely why I shouldn't let it happen. I stood up from the sofa and took a few steps away. Then I said in a heavy voice, "We have to stop this now. Before it's too late, wait." Mrs. Laris didn't answer. She just looked at me with eyes that looked very sad. And at that moment, I realized the most painful reality.
All the efforts I had made so far had not really succeeded in stopping those feelings. In fact, now we were both at the most dangerous point in this relationship, a point where there was only one last choice that was very difficult for me to make.
I stood in the middle of the living room that night with I had never felt fears I had never felt before. On one hand, I wanted to get out of this increasingly dangerous situation immediately. But on the other hand, I also knew that any decision I made would leave a wound. Bularas was still sitting on the sofa, her head lowered. The light of the living room lamp fell softly on her face. From where I stood, I could see how tired she was, holding back all the feelings she had been hiding. Several seconds passed in a very heavy silence. Finally, I said, softly, "Mom, we can't let this continue." Mrs. Laris didn't answer immediately. She just took a deep breath and then nodded slowly. "I know, Arga." Her voice sounded very weak. "I never wanted things to be like this either." I looked at her with mixed feelings. Inside my heart, there was guilt, there was pity, and there was also something more complicated than just those feelings. However, one thing I knew for sure. I have to stop it now. "I will talk to Maya," I finally said. That sentence made Mrs. Laris immediately turn her head. "What?" she asked quietly. "I will not tell everything," I continued quickly. "But I will say that the situation in this house is not healthy if we continue like this." Mrs. Laris looked anxious. "Varga, Maya will misunderstand." "I will not blame anyone," I answered firmly. I walked closer, took the cup of coffee that was starting to get cold. "What is clear is that we have to change something in this house." Mrs. Laris stared at me for a long time. Then slowly she said, "Maybe you have been alone for too long." Those words made my chest feel tight. I just realized how deeply lonely she had been feeling all this time. But that was precisely why I had to make the right decision. The next day, Maya came home from her training. That night after dinner, I asked her to sit in the living room. "Maya, I want to talk to you about something." She looked a little confused, but sat down in front of me anyway. "What's wrong?" I took a deep breath before speaking. I felt like Mom was home alone too often. Maya looked at me seriously. "What do you mean?" "I think we should keep Mom busy so she doesn't feel lonely all the time." Maya was silent for a few seconds. Then suddenly she nodded slowly. I'd been thinking about that for a long time too. I was surprised. "Yes?" I asked. "Yes," Maya answered. "Mom always seemed strong in front of us. But I know she still feels lonely often since Dad died." We talked for a long time that night. And finally we came up with a simple idea. Mrs. Lara has always loved taking care of plants and making herbal drinks So we decided to help her open a small shop on the porch of the house. It doesn't need to be big, just a simple place to sell coffee, hot drinks, and some ornamental plants. When we told her about our plan, Mrs. Laris, the next day, she looked very surprised. "Are you serious?" she asked. Maya smiled. "Of course, Mom," I also nodded, so that the house would not feel lonely anymore. A few weeks later, the small shop was really standing. Every morning, Mrs. Lara was busy preparing drinks. Neighbors began to come to buy coffee, or just to chat. Our once quiet porch was now a busy place. And slowly the atmosphere in our house changed again. The relationship between the three of us was warm again like before. But deep inside my heart, I knew one thing. The decision I made that night was probably the most difficult decision in my life, but also the most corrected decision. The decision may have seemed simple from the outside, just opening a small shop on the porch of the house, just creating a new activity for someone who had lived in silence for too long. But for me, that decision was a boundary that ultimately saved many things.
Several months had passed since that rainy night that almost changed everything. Now every morning the atmosphere in our house was very different from before. If before this house often felt quiet, now there was almost always the sound of people talking on the front porch. Bora's small shop turned out to grow faster than we imagined. Neighbors often came by to drink coffee, buy ornamental plants, or chat about their daily lives. Bueller seemed much more lively. He often laughed as he served customers. Sometimes he would talk at length about his favorite plants. Sometimes he would joke with the neighboring women who came almost every afternoon. Seeing him like that made my heart feel relieved. The loneliness I used to see in his eyes was slowly disappearing. Maya also looked happy. Every weekend, she helped her mother at the shop. They often laughed together on the porch. It was as if the house was filled with life again that had been lost. Sometimes I stood in the living room doorway, watching them from inside. At times like that, I often remembered the night when everything almost changed. The night the power went out, the night when it rained heavily outside, the night Mrs. Laris and I sat alone in the living room by the dim candlelight. If I had made different decisions then, perhaps our lives would not be like this now. Perhaps this house would no longer feel warm. Perhaps Maya would no longer look at me with such trust. And perhaps Mrs. Laris would not be able to smile as freely as she does today. One afternoon, when the shop was starting to quiet down, I sat on the porch with Mrs. Laris. The afternoon breeze blew gently, carrying the aroma of the coffee she had just brewed. We didn't talk much, but the atmosphere between us no longer felt as awkward as before. A distance had been restored, a distance that should have been there from the start. Mrs. Laris suddenly said softly, "R." I turned around. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the front yard, which was starting to turn orange in the light of the setting sun. "Thank you. I'm a little confused as to why." She smiled slightly. "Because you chose to do the right thing."
I was silent for a few seconds. Maybe she never said directly what really happened between us before. But from the way she said it, I knew she understood everything too. I just smiled softly. "This is our home, Mom." She nodded. And at that moment, I realized something very important. In life, sometimes we can be dragged by feelings that come without us planning. Those feelings can arise from loneliness, from small attention, or from closeness that is left too long without limits. But what determines the direction of our lives is not the feeling itself. What really determines is the decision we make after realizing that the feeling is there. I was once at the most dangerous point in my life. The point where one step could destroy the family I had built. But in the end, I chose to stop before it was too late. And now every time I see Maya smiling happily in this house, every time I see Mrs. Laris laughing with the customers in her shop, I always feel grateful, because on that night with her and the dim candlelight, I chose to protect my family